today with our Water and Energy Task Force. We have a very interesting topic and a preeminent scientist that is going to present some innovative ideas related to carbon neutrality. You know, typically our task force has been solely focused on water, and so we're branching out into the energy space, and we could have done that as just as a water issue also, but as we've merged the water and environmental task force, this is very appropriate that, and it's a great start in 2021 to talk about aspirational goals set by the state of California, new goals that seem like are going to be set by the incoming Biden administration, which now we're 24 and a half hours away from and counting. And so it's a good segue into focusing on energy and renewable energy. And as you know, a couple of our refineries in the Bay Area are getting set to pivot over from petroleum product to more bio-based products. So I think the landscape of the Bay Area over the next 50 years is going to change significantly from an oil production standpoint. Also, our vehicles are all certainly headed towards being electrified, and so it's a very interesting time. And as a part of this task force, we will bring up topics that we think are of interest to this group. And if you ever have ideas for us, we meet there's a planning group that meets every other month, and we'd appreciate your input. We're happy to try and bring in whatever speakers or topic that you guys are interested in. So in terms of water, I looked up on the drought monitor this morning. You all know it hasn't really rained at all this year. 79% of our state of California is classified in severe drought, 79%, and 40% of the state is in extreme drought. And so the lack of a snowpack and the lack of rain, really substantive rain in our forecast, is leading to a problem for us. And I see folks here from the water sector. Ernie is on the line, and Zone 7, and so I know you guys are watching this closely, and it's a big deal, and so we'll be talking more about that certainly as the year unfolds. I also went on the state site in terms of where we're at in storage, because last year when we talked about, oh, it's not raining, we had full storage. Right now we're sitting at 46% at Lake Shasta, and we should be at 70%. Oroville's at 35%, and we should be at 56%. So from just from a weather standpoint, 2021 so far is shaping up to be very challenging for the Bay Area in terms of water supplies. So before we turn to energy, I think we'll pause for a second and ask Kristen or Lindy if there are announcements, and anybody else who has announcements at that time can also speak up, and then turn to Dan McIntyre for upcoming meetings so that you know what's on our schedule, and then we'll get back to our regular meeting. So Kristen?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Gary. So again, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. January is always a busy time of year for us as we prepare for our East Bay USA event. This year, obviously, is really different. It's our first virtual East Bay USA. We're excited to feature a conversation, and our moderator is here in this room, Zoom room right now, Ann Notarangelo. But so we made some changes, got some feedback, particularly from our sponsors, that if we can't be serving dinner and serving wine, we should not do this event in the evening. So we're moving it to the daytime. Hopefully you can all participate. And so that's on Thursday, January 28th, midday, 12 o'clock, 12 to 1:30. So Mark Orcutt is not available to any of you because he is working hard, although he is here on this task force. We have just the very best team to produce our event. So, and we're excited about the next two parts. Part 2 will be about the economy, and those details are still going to be worked out. And part 3 is going to be featuring the managing director of the McKinsey San Francisco office about an update from the Women in the Workplace event. And so that'll be on March 25th. And because I think you've all heard a lot about the impact that the pandemic has had on women's employment. I do want to flag, in case you didn't get to watch it, we do have a recording available for members of last week's task force that Lindy organized around all things COVID vaccine. And so I think that there's a lot of information that's important to get out about the vaccine. And I know I spent a lot of time this weekend volunteering at a mobile vaccine clinic here in Lafayette, where I live, and so so just check that out on our website if you haven't already. But I have the gift of gab and would go on and on, but I think I'll leave it there, Gary.
Okay, thanks. And Kristen, just a little recalling from our board meeting, we had a little tribute for Tom Garino. For those of you who don't know, he passed away. He's, the PG&E rep for a long time that we dealt with here in the East Bay, and he died of COVID. And so that's pretty near and dear and close to home. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tom's celebration of life is going to be on Saturday, January 30th. And
yeah.
So yeah, let us know if you want to get information about that. Or Mark is even going to put it in the chat for us. So, and a lot of folks were really touched by Tom. I know I was. So thanks for remembering that, Gary.
Yep, you bet. Okay, Dan, upcoming meetings?
Yeah, we got a full schedule coming ahead over the next 3 months. On February 16th, we're going to review what the rodeo refineries have planned in terms of renewable energy. Looking at conversion to renewable feedstock, so a lot of interesting stuff, and that's almost like a perfect follow-on to today's meeting. So we'll see some practical examples of what we'll talk about today. In March, on the 16th, we're going to have an update on water legislative issues for California. What is the legislature working on? What are they thinking about on water bills, and maybe a couple of other general environmental bills. It'll be a chance for our committee to weigh in on anything that might be working its way through the legislative session this spring. And then tentatively in April, we have a report on Bay Area dredging. So some interesting environmental issues associated with that. We got a full list. We got lots of ideas in the hopper. And as Gary said before, if you have other ideas on the water and environment issues, send them to any of the committee members, and we'll see how we can maybe shoehorn them in.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So as most of you know, I always like to start our meeting with a little bit of humor. And I know these are dark times. We've had a tough 2020 and we're emerging in 2021. But my wife shared with me a YouTube video that I just think I got such a kick out of it, because if you've raised kids, or you know of little kids and they're 2 years old and 3 years old, 25% to 30% of their life has been spent in COVID and learning what COVID means to them. So a big chunk of their life is about COVID. So Mark, if you could roll that, I'd appreciate it, and we'll see if it works. So this is a young lady that's she is washing her hands at every stop of the way. And she can't reach that.
One less thing to train the child on, right?
Yeah, exactly. Poor kids. Okay, so turning our attention now to energy. In July, the incoming President Biden-elect announced a plan to generate 100% of our U.S. electricity from carbon-free sources like solar, wind, nuclear, and hydropower. And I'm not entirely sure about the hydropower part, because it carries with it so many challenges. But an aspirational goal at the federal level, we'll see where that goes. In 2018, Governor Brown signed into law SB 100, where it calls for California to become carbon neutral by 2045. And today we have the esteemed speaker, Roger Aines, who is Chief Scientist at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab over the entire energy program, so very high level in Lawrence Livermore. And we're very thrilled and honored to have you, Roger. His background was included in our announcement, so I won't just read that. But I would say I have done some work out at the Lawrence Livermore and some work with Roger, and the talent pool out there will knock your socks off. And I know the genesis of the Lawrence Livermore has been more around nuclear arms development, protecting the United States, which they're doing a lot of work, great work. But in the last 5 years, and Roger, you may characterize this differently, but or to 10 years, has been what can the labs do across the nation for other aspects of our society. And so energy is one that is a big focus. Water was one that I've worked on a focus for in terms of advanced treatment and new technologies. And if you get the opportunity to go out to the Lawrence Livermore, it's like, in my opinion, it's like the Disneyland of scientists. It's, you know, I've had briefings out there. It's just amazing the types of things that they're talking about. And so, Roger, appreciate you joining us this morning and introducing a great topic for us.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you for all the great work you've done with us over the years. I have to tell you, we have the same opinion of Gary. He's a terrific guy, and all of his connections and all of his knowledge about water in the state have been incredibly useful for us. So thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. So I'm going to address this issue of how can we imagine getting to a carbon neutral economy? What does that mean to, you know, eat a state where we're not emitting any more carbon than we're absorbing, or in other words, where the atmosphere isn't changing? And that's gotten to be the new goal. And it really came out of the latest set of UN analyses that said, if we want to stay under 2 degrees C of warming, we have to get to zero. We have to get to the point where we're no longer changing the carbon content of the atmosphere. And that's a pretty challenging goal. And 4 years ago, we looked at that at the lab, and I took this to my director, and he said, well, that looks like that's impossible. We better start now. And so we've been investing heavily in this question of what does it mean to get to a carbon neutral economy? What are the technologies that are going to be used? What are the systems that are going to be used? What is the economics? You know, what are the things now? What are the things that we're going to need for science? And when we were looking at that, it became, as California started making these aspirational goals, we said, well, you know, we have all the things in California that we need to do this well. And we started talking about it. And the Climate Works Foundation funded us to do this study of what are the options for actually getting California to zero. So next slide, Mark. We've always had, one more click, we've had very strong environmental goals here in California. And basically we've had targets for CO2 emissions. Go ahead and click again. And our current target to get to in 2030, the nearest one, is basically to cut our carbon emissions about in half. And then we have a longer term target, which currently is set in 2050, which is to get to about 10% of our, I'm sorry, about 20% of our current 1990 emissions. Our baseline here in California was set in 1990. And so the Air Board is responsible for putting together the plans to do this. And they've looked at all the technology that it's going to take to get there. And they have a rough plan for how to get to that 20% of current emissions by 2050. And that's the level that's shown on here, the far right bar graph. And basically that plan uses every piece of technology that we have. It's electrifying everything, capturing all the carbon we can get, as much efficiency as we can get. And it gets us to 20%. Well, click again. Now we have a new goal in red. like everything was not enough. Now we have to do better than that. We want to get to zero by 2045. And this is the same goal that President Biden has announced that 14 nations around the world have, that 1,100 corporations now have announced. Everybody wants to get to zero because that's what it's going to take to stay below 2 degrees C of warming. And so that's what we set out to evaluate. How are we going to do that? If we've already used every tool in the arsenal, what else are we going to do? Well, we're going to need some new tools. So click again. And what those new tools are is we call, this funny term, negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal. It's basically technologies that are going to reduce the CO2 concentration in the air, not just stop it from increasing, but actively reduce it. And I know a lot of you work in water pollution, and this is a hard thing to think about. You don't stop pollution by going out in the river and collecting the river and cleaning it up. But unfortunately, that's the position we've left ourselves in with regard to the atmosphere, because we've already put too much CO2 in the air, and it's more or less permanent on a human time scale. It's not coming out. So, and what we did for California was to look at the current toolbox, the aspirational goal, the 2045 net zero, and said, well, how much of these negative emissions would we need in order to get to, reliably to get to zero in 2045? So we actually calculated that we need 125 million tons, whereas the Air Board's official calculations is 86 million tons. Well, things go wrong, schedules don't work. We padded it to give some assurance that we'd actually get there. And we came up with this need of, by 2045, we need to have 125 million tons, which means we need to start developing these things. Just for scale, a big power plant will emit maybe 2 million or 1 million tons of CO2, a big natural gas-fired power plant here in California. So that gives you a scale of, what kind of technology we're talking about in order to get here. And we got a team together, 22 authors from a number of institutions, and said, let's look at how to do this. And the way we did this was not to try and do it as an academic exercise. We didn't say we're going to take only published things. We took published things where they were available. But we also used our good engineering sense. We said, what can we do that matches what we think is practical, what we think is going to be safe and reasonable to do, what we think people in the state of California will accept? That's a big part of it. Let's not go out and try to develop technologies that we think people are immediately going to object to. And we put together a package of things. Click again. And I'll summarize here quickly what that package is, and then I'll go into some of the details. There's basically 3 things that we can use to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in California. The first, you've probably heard a lot about, you're in an environmental group, you're probably engaged in this, and that's natural and working lands. What do we mean by that? We mean, first of all, planting trees, reforesting places that have lost their forests. There isn't that much of that in California. We didn't deforest California the way that they did on the East Coast. It's restoring wetlands, that can be a big deal. It's adding carbon to soils, particularly agricultural soils and pasture lands. And we looked at that in detail. We worked with a lot of experts, and particularly we took the calculations that have been done by the Nature Conservancy here and said, what's the most we could possibly do? How well can we do there? And the answer was about 25 million tons a year. And a lot of that, by the way, is dependent upon slowing down the use of forest, slowing down the timber cutting rate in forests. That's a really good way to increase the carbon storage in forests. But at any rate, this optimistic view was that we could get 25 million tons a year with natural solutions. So those are cheap. They have tremendous ecological benefits, particularly for water. Obviously, having healthy forests leads to clean water. And we can get 25 million tons that way. That's really good. We should do that, and it's important. The next thing we looked at was really driven by the fact that the state is going to be removing a lot of wood from the forests in order to thin them for fire control. That the issue here is that California's forests were sort of clear-cut in 1900, more or less, and then allowed to regrow willy-nilly. And what grew back was much denser than a normal forest would have been, and we were fighting the fires there, and so the fires weren't burning and clearing underbrush the way that you would expect. And so we've grown a much denser forest than we like, and that leads to these incredibly intense wildfires. Well, the current plan from the state is to clear 1 million acres, not clear, but thin. I always make that mistake. Thin 1 million acres a year. And that would generate 15 million tons of wood waste. And what happens to that today? It's piled up and burned. So that's not a great outcome in terms of air quality, in terms of, certainly in terms of CO2. The CO2 just goes back up in the air. But that generated us to the idea of looking at what could we do with that material to keep that carbon from going back up in the air. And we added to that looking at all kinds of other waste, agricultural waste, sewage, all the organic waste in the state. And what we discovered was with existing conversion technologies and capturing the carbon on those conversion technologies, that could be a huge contributor to negative emissions. So what we're talking about are things like making a biofuel out of that wood. And in the course of making the biofuel, about half of the carbon that goes into the factory goes up the stack as CO2. So instead of emitting that CO2 from the biofuel facility, we capture it, put it underground. And by doing that, we can save a lot. And it turns out that if we're making hydrogen, you can capture all of the carbon. So hydrogen is very important. But if we do that, we could catch 83 million tons of CO2 a year from California waste that already exists. This is things that are not being used or have very low value. Sometimes it's used for bedding and agricultural waste, things like that. But most of it's not being used, so we could use it, turn it into a valuable product, and remove CO2 from the atmosphere in the process of doing that. Huge win. The last thing is something that you've probably heard a lot about, and that's a direct air capture. And these are machines like the one you see here that's in Zurich, Switzerland, that a machine just catches CO2 from the air and concentrates it, and then you dispose of that CO2 permanently. These machines exist today at 15 sites around the world. They work, they're expensive. They're at least $600 a ton. But people have hopes that we can drive the price down. But basically, this is, again, one of these questions of running out of tools. If we've used all the natural solutions we have, and we've used all the biomass that we have in the state, what else do we have? Well, then we just have to build these machines. So if we need to get to that total of 125 million tons, we're still going to need to do some direct air capture. And frankly, direct air capture is an appealing idea because it's really straightforward. It's pretty clear what it impacts. You build the machine, you use renewable energy, you put the CO2 underground, you put a meter on the pipe, you see how much CO2 went underground. And so that's a straightforward thing to measure. So this is our sort of overall framework of what California could do to add tools to its portfolio to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. Next slide. The waste biomass California is a huge part of it. We were surprised at how much organic waste there is in California and how evenly distributed it is. Of course, we have a lot of forest waste that you see in the north in the red bars, and we would expect that. We see agricultural waste in yellow in the central bars, and that's not a surprise. We have 1 million tons of almond shells a year in the state, 1 million tons of waste shells. But we also have the organic waste that comes from the cities. And here we've corrected the amount for the amount that's just organic. So it's paper, wood, things that, were in the organics that were in the atmosphere recently, not any fossil fuel based things like plastics. And those are, of course, concentrated around the cities. And the net is that we have about 45 million tons of this organic waste. And it's typically about half carbon by weight. If you convert it into CO2, that's more than 100 million tons of CO2 that is coming from this. And of course, most of this is decaying today and emitting this CO2 one way or another. Unfortunately, in some cases, it's turning into methane. You don't want that to happen. We estimate that in 2045, there's going to be even more, just growth of the state, growth of some activities. And so by utilizing this waste biomass, we think this is the most important thing that the state has available. I know some of you work in wastewater processing, and you're familiar with this issue of what do you do with this waste biomass? And of course, anaerobic digesters are already processing that. And that's one of the great worked examples of how to take waste biomass, turn it into a fuel, in this case, methane. And I'm sure that all of you who are doing that, though, are emitting this CO2 from your anaerobic digesters. And I'm hoping to talk you into catching that CO2 and putting it underground. Next slide. So beginning with that pool of waste material that we have to work with, we said, what are the technologies that we could use to convert that? And so we have on the left, we have these 4 different pools of waste organics that we have available. And then on the right, we have the various conversion technologies and what kind of product they're going to turn into. And, you know, this is a huge combination of different technologies and things that we can use. So we applied some criteria here. We said, first of all, we have to be able to remove 1 million tons a year of CO2, or else we just don't have time to think about it. It was a quick report. We did this all in 6 months. There are things that are smaller than that. Unfortunately, one of the things that's smaller than that is the CO2 that's emitted from those anaerobic digesters, less than 1 million tons a year. And we looked at all the different technologies that could be applied to it. And then we looked at how much CO2 you could capture from the process and what the cost of capturing that CO2 would be. Now, this is a little different than people have thought about bioenergy in the past. We're not looking at how cheaply or how expensive the energy could be that came out of it. So let's say we're making hydrogen out of a gasification process that takes forest waste and turns it into hydrogen, which is a relatively straightforward thing to do. We just assumed the cost of the hydrogen was going to be today's wholesale price. And then we calculated how much extra would we have to pay to dispose of the CO2. So now we're finding out what's the price of doing CO2 management by using this method. So we're going to get the value from the products that we're making and then pay to have CO2 removed. So this becomes the cost to the state of actually that 125 million tons of CO2 removal. Next slide. And we built this cumulative cost distribution that many of you who followed carbon have seen the thing called the McKenzie curve. It's built in the same way. It's basically in the vertical axis is the cost of the CO2 per ton to eliminate it. And then on the horizontal axis are the different technologies that we found, or the ones that worked, and not, there were many other technologies that basically didn't make it onto this chart because they were more expensive or that we didn't think they were feasible. And then we stack these in terms of the relative cost. So you start with the least expensive ones and you keep adding technologies, adding the more and more expensive ones until you get to your 125 million ton total that you said you wanted to calculate. And we see that the natural solutions are unsurprisingly the least expensive. And so you'd want to do those first. And we are, in fact, doing those first. Then in the reds and orange in the middle are all these biomass-based solutions. And if you look at it carefully, what you'll see is that many of those are converting biomass into hydrogen. Why did we pick hydrogen? Well, pretty straightforward if you think about it. If you turn the biomass into hydrogen, all the CO2 is available to store underground. So you've now made a valuable product, hydrogen, and you've caught more CO2 for the same process. So that CO2 is less expensive. And it turns out that it's really quite inexpensive, that we can catch CO2 with these processes on the order of $60 to $80 a ton. And that's pretty much the going price for carbon capture from a fossil fuel, a concentrated fossil fuel source. So this is a pretty good deal. What this is removing that amount of CO2 from the atmosphere for a very low price. On the far right, you see the cost of direct air capture, the 2 highest bars. There's 2 kinds there. One that's fueled by natural gas. You basically need heat to run direct air capture. So you either getting that heat from natural gas and capturing all the CO2 as well, or using geothermal. And of course, in California, we have a lot of geothermal. Much of it's unused. So that turns out to be a little better use. What we've done here, though, is we calculated how much would direct air capture cost in the long run after about 30 million tons of capacity was built out. And we had a lot of discussion about exactly how to choose that number. Today, if you wanted to go out and buy direct air capture from Climeworks in Switzerland, that company that I showed the picture of, it would cost you $1,000 a ton. But we think once enough of those facilities are built, that the cost will come in to the vicinity of a couple $100 per ton, and maybe after 100 million tons of capacity is built, which is, you know, worldwide application of this technology, the cost would come down to 100. But it's still going to be the most expensive technology for cleaning up the atmosphere that we have, and it'll be the one that we use last and hopefully least of because it's the most expensive. But remember that expense is not the only thing that we're looking at here. We're also worried about things like land use and other environmental impacts. And so direct air capture may actually sneak ahead of some of these other ones because it works better in some of those areas. Now, I want to take a minute here, Gary, and just ask if there's any questions about this chart before I go into detail, because I know I've talked about a lot of things, and this is a pretty important chart. This is the basis for sort of how you would make decisions about this, and I'm glad to answer any questions about this while it's up if people want to know.
So Roger, can you hear? This is Gary. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I know that Doug asked a question related to forestry that's in the chat room, and we'll get to that in a second. But question I have for you is, you know, we have the some carbon taxation going on in this state right now. The cap and trade funds are huge out there. Is that a source of funding for these aspirational goals at this point?
It certainly could be. I think cap and trade has not met a lot of our expectations, but everything on this chart, except for the natural solutions, everything in red, brown, and gray is acceptable for the low carbon fuel standard. The low carbon fuel standard is basically constrains the fossil content or the emissions of our transportation fuels. And by basically what it does is sets a cap on the carbon intensity of those fuels, and that cap decreases every year. If you want to sell a fuel in California, you have to stay under the cap. If your fuel, for instance, if you're selling a conventional fossil fuel, if you will be above the cap. And so you can either mix biofuel in, or you can buy credits from somebody who exceeded the cap. And those credits are sold on an open market. The state doesn't participate in that purchase. It's handled between private parties. And today those sell for $200 a ton. So if you look at this chart, you'll see that everything on the chart is less than $200 a ton. So I admit I'm not an economist. There's a lot of things in between building these facilities and making this happen, but these are all in costs that we consider: capital, financing, you know, the amortization, the full cost of building and operating these facilities. Our prediction is that every one of these is a moneymaker under the LCFS if it continues at that $200 a ton price.
Yeah, that's good. And so I think a part of the work that has to be done here is who is going to take that on, right? In terms of coming up with these big projects that, you know, they're able to finance them, but also be able to get the money from these different pots of money in order to make all of this work. And so have you reached out to the high-tech industry like the Googles and Microsoft and Apple, and are they interested in participating in this?
They are. In fact, we're helping Microsoft put together their strategy for, you know, Microsoft is one of the leading companies that says they have a net neutrality goal. The question of financing these things is interesting. I made that comment to Wade Crowfoot right after this report came out back in January, and we were still meeting in person. I said, you know, these things are money makers today. And he turns to me and says, well, why aren't we doing it then? And the answer is we are. There are 2 facilities in construction right now that are probably complete and in testing operation right now. In COVID days, we don't hear as much as we'd like to. One in Reno and one in Southern Oregon. Why aren't they in California? Well, guess what? It's hard to build things in California. But they're doing similar things. As they aren't storing the CO2 underground, but they're processing, doing all the wood processing and waste processing to make these fuels. There are a couple of other facilities that are in construction that are going to do the full cycle. One from Clean Energy Systems, which is going to take agricultural waste and turn it into hydrogen, and another one from Air Liquide. Boy, I get those confused. I'll get myself in trouble. Air Liquide, who are building a facility in Las Vegas, and they're going to use methane that comes from anaerobic digesters and use that to make hydrogen and capture the CO2. So these things are happening. The financing, though, is the hard part. A full-size facility that does this kind of work is $1 billion investment.
Wow. So we have a couple of questions in chat so far. One of them is, if we reduce timber harvesting in California, Will there be an offsetting increases in timber production elsewhere, in your opinion? And what are the physical constraints of underground storage of CO2?
Yeah, I'll answer the timber now, and the geology is coming up shortly. Yes, absolutely. This is called additionality, and the question is, if we, obviously people use the same amount of timber where it's harvested from. This is a big problem. People who've looked at these forest offset programs think that the only rational way to control them is by national boundaries. You can't say, one group of acreage is cutting back its timber because the guys next door just cut more. We readily admit that that is a flaw in how to do this, and the assumption is that if you could control it and monitor it accurately, you might be able to do this well, but that's a big deal. Basically, this is something that is important to the forestry community to work out, and I'm not an expert in that. And we basically took the advice and the results of people like the Nature Conservancy who were doing this. So I think that's something that the state has to look at really carefully.
Okay. One other question on the natural solutions is, what are the dynamics between natural solutions, i.e. more trees, right, versus forest management, less trees?
The trick about trees is the bigger they are, the better they are. Trees, as they continue to grow, absorb more and more carbon every year, which, I mean, of course they absorb carbon every year, but their actual number of tons per tree increases every year. So you want your trees to get as big and as old as you can. And little scruffy trees don't absorb very much compared to a nice big ponderosa pine or, a great big redwood. So the trick is to make your trees as big as possible, and trees like to have a little separation. That's how they get big. So in fact, a properly separated forest with space in between the trees is absorbing more carbon than the kinds of forests we have today, which are very fuel dense. So it's basically going to be good for carbon. It's going to be good for wildfire. And the question is, how do we get to the point where we're doing that, in a way that's sustainable? The state's going to spend the money doing this. They've got $1 billion allocated to do this. Right now, they're only treating maybe 50,000 acres a year, not 1 million acres a year. So there's a long way to go.
Okay, good, thanks. Go ahead and continue, and we'll
All right.
answer more chat questions later on.
All right. Go ahead, Mark. So for those of you who are into the economics of it, this is a little figure about how we calculate the cost of doing these things. And the end of that cost calculation is this extracted version of what's the actual adding CO2 management cost in this process. So you do a normal process where you're making hydrogen or you're making jet fuel, you're doing one of the things I mentioned, then when you add the CO2 management, how much does it cost? And then you end up with the cost of the CO2. So let's look at an example of an industrial process that we do here in the Bay Area. Next slide. We make a lot of hydrogen in the Bay Area. It's all made inside the refineries today. And that's not going to change when we start switching to making biofuels here. We still need to add hydrogen to those biofuels in order to make them into good transportation fuels. And we also want to have hydrogen for separate uses. I'm not sure that we're ever going to have very many hydrogen cars, but I think hydrogen trucks are reality. And boy, if you had hydrogen at the Port of LA, they'd buy every bit you could sell them right now, because they want to run their heavy transport vehicles in the port with hydrogen, because air pollution is such a major problem for a big concentrated source like that. So hydrogen has a lot of transportation uses. It has a lot of chemical industry uses. It's something that's going to grow in demand. Well, in this figure on the far right, you see that with our conventional processes of making it from methane, we emit about 7 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen that we make. Well, what if we just captured that CO2? Well, a conventional process, like if you put it on the steam methane reformers that we have in the refineries in the Bay Area today, you could knock that down to about 3 kilograms of CO2. If you built new state-of-the-art hydrogen reformers that are called autothermal reformers, or ATRs, you'll hear people say, they're much more efficient. you could knock it down to about a kilogram or maybe less with full ATR. So you're getting pretty close to zero. In fact, you could probably catch 95% of the carbon that comes out of a good modern ATR. But what if you started feeding it with biogas? Well, that's a pretty interesting question because, you know, the biogas that comes out of your anaerobic digesters at your waste facilities today was in the atmosphere a year ago. And so we count that as, you know, net neutral. And if you, instead of firing your facility with fossil methane, you fired it with biogas and captured the CO2, you could be down to a 7 kilograms removed from the atmosphere for every kilogram of hydrogen that you make. Completely flip the scale. So now in making hydrogen, you're cleaning up the atmosphere instead of adding CO2 to the atmosphere. And if you took your anaerobic digesters and put carbon capture on them, recognizing all the CO2 that they're emitting, you could run that number to as low as -20. So by making hydrogen with these facilities, you could be removing 20 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen that you make. That's a huge win. Making the same product that you want to have to begin with. Oh boy, I hope you guys can't hear that. Always people working outside your window when you're trying to talk. But that by making a product that we already make in the Bay Area that we want to have more of, we could feed it with a different feedstock. Instead of feeding it with fossil fuel, we could feed it with methane from these anaerobic digesters. Unfortunately, there's not very much of that compared to the scale of this. Or feed it with this biomass from the agriculture or from the forestry cleanup and obtain a huge benefit for the atmosphere. And the money on this, when you look at the LCFS price on this, your hydrogen that you make from this now has a very negative carbon footprint, and the low carbon fuel standard keeps paying you the more negative you get. It's a wonderfully designed system. So the better your process gets, the more you get paid. It really encourages innovation, and you know, basically it encourages people to do as good a job as they can because they're going to get paid for it. And this is a big win. And this is an example of something that the companies who run some of these hydrogen processes here in the Bay Area are thinking about doing. Next. Well, what are we going to do with all that carbon dioxide? Well, put as much of it as we can into trees and into soils and into wetlands. But as I said, it's a pretty small fraction of what we ultimately need. Basically, it's going to have to go back underground. There's nothing else that can handle that amount. The good news is that when you compress CO2 to not very high pressures, the same kind of pressures you see in a cylinder in your doctor's office, or the pressures you see when you're about 3,000 feet underground, it turns into a liquid. And that liquid has very similar properties to oil, has about the same density, about the same viscosity. And if you put CO2 into rocks or the same kind of rocks that held oil, the CO2 will stay in those rocks just like the rocks held the oil. And this is a thing that we've looked at for 20 years in the technology framework. It's been the oldest project doing this is in Norway, has been putting 1 million tons underground at a natural gas processing facility, 1 million tons a year of CO2 for 20 years. In the United States, we've looked at this experimentally, and we've put 14 million tons underground in experiments, looking for problems, looking for leaks, looking for environmental issues, and we found none. What we found is the existing controls that we have, which are basically under the federal EPA, are adequate to control this kind of a process. So basically it works, we can do it, and we can expect the CO2 to stay there permanently. Now, we all know that oil occasionally leaks out from 1,000 feet or 3,000 feet underground, but not very often. You actually have to work pretty hard to get it out of there. And the same would be true for CO2. We can expect it to stay there permanently underground and safely. So the next question is, do we have the places to put that in California? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Not a surprise. We produced a lot of oil in California. We have a lot of rocks. And so we did a really simple exercise here. We did you've heard the joke about looking for your car keys underneath the street light because that's the only place you can see it. Well, we did that same thing here. We looked at the oil fields in California because that's where the data is. If you've drilled an oil well in California, you have to file the data with, well, now it's CalGEM, was Dogger. And so all that data is available. So we can take it and we can say which of these fields are appropriate for geologic storage. So we looked at all the fields in these two big areas, in the gas fields of the Delta and in the oil fields around the Bakersfield region in Kern County, and said, which of these meet the federal standards, the EPA standard for doing this? And then California has a new standard, part of this low carbon fuel standard that I mentioned, that says if you want to get paid to put this stuff underground, you have to meet these additional requirements. And that amounts to the most strict CO2 management rule in the world. It's absolutely the most protective that exists anywhere. And so we applied those rules as well. We said the fields have to meet those rules. And those are things like it has to have 2 cap rocks on top of it, not just 1. It has to have a bottom cap rock underneath it so that it can't leak out the bottom. You know, the state adds things like that. And fundamentally, you can't put it into drinking water. All of these have to be more than 10,000 ppm total salt, water that would never be drinking water. So and there's a lot more rules than that, but I'm not going to bother you with them right now. But basically, we looked at those and our good engineering judgment. We said, which of these really work well? Which of them might work better than others? And we plotted them all up. And not surprisingly, the ones that are in bright green are the ones that are really good. The ones that are really dark green are the very best. And the ones that are in red don't work. And I have to tell you, this is the most influential slide I've ever made in my life, because you put it on here and policymakers look at it and they say, whoa, a scientist actually saying something won't work. He's not explaining to me how I can fix it. No, it won't work. You can't do it there. Doesn't meet the regulations, isn't technically safe. And the other side of the coin that's really interesting are the green things. People look at those green areas and they go, oh, the price of CO2 in the LCFS is $200 a ton, and you've told me my land is good for putting it there. We created a land rush. It's really, you know, there are people like, yeah, I'd like to do that. I'd like to understand how I can get paid to, and of course, all of these lands are places where oil and gas development is going on. So people understand what's going on there. So this has been a very helpful and productive chart. And what the summary of this is that we have an enormous amount of storage space under California. Just on this chart, we have 17 billion, with a B, billion tons of storage available. And we applied all the conservative factors that you'd want to on here. There's a lot more than that there if you optimize these storage facilities. Of course, once you build one of these things, you're going to optimize it. But fact is, the state has a lot of good places to do it. It's in places where we've done oil and gas development in the past, and it's in places where it can be done safely and effectively according to the most strict regulations in the world. Next slide. And by the way, this is what one of those facilities looks like. That's the whole thing. You're looking at it. Everything's underground. It's basically a well. You inject the CO2, you reverse the flow. You know, if you were taking gas out of a gas reservoir, you reverse it and put CO2 back into that reservoir. And it's just a wellhead, it's a Christmas tree. You know, it's the pressure monitoring facilities that you need. And of course, you know, other monitoring facilities you might need around it to make sure that there aren't problems occurring. But we looked at how much the transportation and storage would cost. And we have a lot of data from around the world now for doing this. As I say, we've been doing this for 20 years. And it's not very expensive. The transportation is the biggest part of it by far, but it's still less than $10 a ton for the total of transportation and building these facilities and storing it. Why is it so cheap to do this? Well, because they put a lot of CO2 underground. This one well that you're looking at here is putting 1 million tons of CO2 underground per year. So relatively inexpensive to do and relatively straightforward. Uses existing oil technology, and I'm pleased to say would use the same jobs, the same drillers, the same lunch trucks, the same mechanics, the same unions. So this is a thing that, you know, I think the future of California, as we transition away from oil, one of the things that we can transition to is CO2 storage. Next. So what's the total cost on this? Well, as I told you before, we started with 125 million tons and said, you know, if we needed to add all these tools and remove 125 million tons, how much extra would that now cost the state of California to do this? And the answer was about $8 billion a year for that cumulative distribution that I showed you, which was the best case in all cases. But then we said, let's vary it. What if the cost of the products varies, the hydrogen or the fuel? What if the cost of CO2 storage varies? What if the amount of biomass available varies? That turns out to be a big factor, because if you do less biomass, you need to do more expensive direct air capture. And we applied those things, and what we discovered was that if you change them by relatively reasonable amounts, which is shown over on the right there, plus or minus 20%, you change the value by a couple of $1 billion. Now, what does this mean in terms of the state of California? Well, this is about 1/3 of what we spend on trash today. So, this is an entirely affordable thing. Now, it's not going to pay for itself. We're not going to get lucky like we did with solar panels, where they're cheaper than our existing source and they're going to pay for themselves. This is taking out the trash. We're going to have to pay to do it. But the good news is that the payment is not going to be terribly expensive. And we expect these technologies to get cheaper with time, whereas our economy will grow with time. So the pain will get smaller and smaller with time. And recognizing that a lot of things can vary with time, we also think that the error on these estimates is pretty safely, comfortably within the amount that the state can afford to do. So we think this is a reasonable thing for the state to do. We think they can afford to do it. We think that the mechanisms by which the state decides to pay for this have yet to be worked out. And I'm not going to propose those. That's for the legislature. And we spend a lot of time explaining this to the legislature, and they're thinking about how to do this and what kind of appropriate mechanisms make sense here to do. Next. So the other thing about this is that this is a robust set of a mixture. Remember, I had those 50 different technologies, and we have all those biomass sources. Which things have to be perfect to work out? None of them. Basically, if something doesn't work, there's another way to replace it. There's a variety of different technologies that are pretty close. The costs are all pretty similar. And so we can mix and match and meet our local needs and meet our political needs and meet our technology needs. Do we want to build these things in the Central Valley? Do we want to build these things in the forest? It doesn't change the price very much. That's the good news. And basically, everything you want to do is going to stay pretty much in the same price. Next. So what do we need to make this vision happen? Well, we basically need between 50 and 100 biomass plants that process this trash, basically the waste. It's not COVID. I'm allergic to something, but drying out here. We need 50 to 100 plants to process all this material. And these can replace some of the existing and very dirty biomass facilities that we have around the state today. They're going out of business because they're too expensive. So that's good news. So we actually clean up air quality by doing this, because these plants don't emit anything. They're basically converting everything, and with very little smokestack emissions. We probably need a CO2 pipeline network. We don't need it to start with. We can start moving these things even by truck, or we can move it by rail. It's not that expensive. But ultimately, you probably need a backbone pipeline, shown here in red, that runs from where the biomass is to where the CO2 storage is. And the question of whether you ship biomass or whether you ship CO2, again, doesn't make any difference. We can work that out. But frankly, the economics look pretty good to build these industrial facilities in the Central Valley near where the CO2 storage is as well, which are those purple dots. And we need to develop the CO2 storage. There are at least 6 projects in development in the state now, but the state's regulatory process was not designed for this. It is a robust regulatory process. We covered all the bases that need to be done, but it's a complicated thing. There's no one party somebody goes to and says, what do I do to get a permit to inject CO2 underground? And so the state has a workforce right now that's looking at what can be done to basically understand how to combine or how to share data and how to make sure that you don't force a project to go and deal with 20 different agencies, or realistically 5 or 6 different major agencies that they'd have to right now. So the state's looking at how to improve that process without reducing any of the environmental controls. It's going to help with wildfire management because you're now going to create a valuable product out of these things and make it, you know, put more jobs up into the forest and reduce the cost of this fire control that we all need to do. It helps create a low carbon future for today's oil industry because you start doing things that use these same jobs, use these same people, use these same skills. And because you're no longer open burning all of this material, we believe there'll be a dramatic improvement in air quality. And this is one of the key benefits of doing it. Final slide. In conclusion, we think it's quite reasonable for California to reach its goal of net neutrality by 2045. The combination of electrification of vehicles, electrification of home heating and industry, and these negative emissions options, which basically take care of all the little things around the edges, agriculture, you know, the hot rod that you keep in your garage and you drive it, you know, once a month, that you're going to keep until 2100. You know, there's going to be a source of emissions that we just don't ultimately control, and negative emissions can take care of this. An important element of this is that the plan could be achieved faster than 2045 if we chose to. There's very little in what I've described that couldn't be done faster than 2045. And the new jobs and environmental benefits will be substantial. Thank you for your time, and I'm glad to answer more questions.
Thank you, Roger. That was fascinating. I've got a couple of questions, and if people wouldn't mind using the chat, and we'll go through your questions one by one. But Mark, can you go back a couple of slides, about 5 slides, to where it showed underground storage as being where it's available in the state of California? And maybe you can, yeah, there we go. And so when I look at that, Roger, I see a lot of green in the Delta. And I know there's quite a bit of state land out there, several of the islands. And I'm wondering if you've approached the state about, excuse me, setting up a storage facility in the Delta, and what their thoughts on that are.
I have to be a little cautious about what the plans are of people in the Delta. I can say the state is very aware of this, very interested in it, both as a regulator and as a landowner. This is an active conversation that's going on in Wade's shop right now. And they brought on Matt Baker to be a deputy secretary who, this is, his title is for energy, but this is one of the major things that he's working on. And so the what I believe will be the earliest project to start doing this commercial project will come from one of those steam methane reformers, and will go into that area in the Delta as a private commercial project. The state's looking at that, you know, from a regulatory aspect. The thing about the Delta that turns out to be interesting is that it's owned in big chunks. People own big chunks of land out there, and that's what it takes. You know, one of these CO2 storage facilities needs a footprint of, let's say, 5 square miles, approximately. So you need people who own land on that scale, or can get a small group of landowners together on that scale, so they can agree to do this, because you can't just force people to do this underneath their land. They have to agree to it. Of course, they agree to it, they're going to get paid. And the state is one of those landowners, as are a number of other organizations that you're all familiar with.
Okay, thanks.
I'm not trying to be evasive there. I'm trying to respect confidentiality.
No, I understand. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, the Delta, anytime you say Delta, it attracts a whole lot of attention right from the get-go. So, but it just is curious to me to see how ideal that part of California is for a carbon storage project. So Dave Richardson, I see you have a question regarding hydrogen.
Thank you, Gary. I just wanted to say, you've mentioned how hydrogen can be used effectively as a fuel, high demand at the Port of LA, for example. How best can we store hydrogen as a fuel?
that's probably one of the big things that has to be resolved. You know, there's a big new project called the Intermountain Power Plant in Utah that is going to power, ultimately would be a completely hydrogen powered power plant. And they want to store the hydrogen in salt domes that they have available there. Unfortunately, those are not present in California, so we can't do that. You probably could store CO2 in existing store hydrogen in existing natural gas storage facilities. But of course, then you'd have to clean it up afterwards. I think that's yet to be resolved. That's one of the things that has to be figured out. I'll tell a funny story about that though. Microsoft is interested in, powering their data centers, not the normal power. They have 100% renewable energy to provide the normal power for their data centers. But of course that power they have to have backup power. And today they use diesel and they're like, that's not what we want. So they've looked at hydrogen, and the fellow who's in charge of this figured out how much they need, and how many fuel cells they would need to do that, and how much hydrogen. And it turns out there's a liquid hydrogen tank available that would power most of these data centers. And so he calls up the company that supplies these tanks and says, talks to them about price and says, well, what's your bulk discount? And the guy says, I don't know. We never sold more than one. I think we're just on the edge. It's a new thing, and you're just going to have to figure that out.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Doug Wallace, I see a question from you.
Sure, thanks, Gary. I'm curious about how the use of biomass, as you're describing it, would replace or displace prescribed burning, and if you scaled up biomass utilization this way, what are the environmental impacts of that? Because as I envision it, there's roads, there's transportation, and so forth of all that material.
Yes. However, in our evaluation, we didn't include any roadless areas or any areas that were sensitive, slopes that were too high, things like that. So these are basically areas that are already being accessed. And, all of them basically have been logged, which is why we have a problem to begin with. So I'm not an expert on the total range of environmental impacts, but they're similar to what you would have if you went into controlled burns, where you need the access as well. We see this as a serial kind of activity where you go in and remove a lot of fuel, and then in the long run, you continue doing controlled burns to maintain the sort of natural state that the forest would have had if we weren't controlling the forest fires. One of the things that we think is really important about this right now is to get out and demonstrate these things. We need to understand, not just from some propeller head like me telling you what the risks are, but to get up in the forest and do these things and test them and measure them and see what the water runoff looks like, and see how the number of trucks, and really demonstrate those. And when we talk to the state legislature about this, one of the fascinating things they come back with is they say, yeah, that's right. And we need to test the regulatory process. We need to see how well all of these mechanisms actually work to control all of these things. So, I think that we're confident that these things can be done well, but that's going to need to be demonstrated. And there's obviously going to be adjustments that are made in the course of doing that. And as always, the issue is, what's the alternative? What are you comparing it to? And are you willing to make those changes?
Thank you very much.
So Roger, along those lines, I've worked for the Forest Service at the beginning of my career and laid out a lot of timber sales, and know about the economics associated with forest management. It's very expensive to pile brush and then haul it somewhere to be either gasified or some way to capture the carbon content out of that. And actually the Forest Service owns the majority of our forested lands or control it in the state of California. So is the state working with the feds, and what can be done, I guess, in terms of that cost factor? It's just not economically viable, I think, to have to place brush and small trees onto trucks.
Well, it turns out that it's not economically viable to take that and then burn it to make energy.
Yeah. Because
wood is kind of a crappy energy source. That's why we don't use it much anymore. but that truck full of wood chips is 50% carbon by weight, 50%. So this was a real surprise to us when we ran the numbers on all of these things, because we know how much it costs to do all these activities in the forest. We get real numbers from the Forest Service. And but when we put it into that algorithm where we calculated the cost of the CO2, we're now moving an enormous amount more carbon than we were energy. And so it turns out that we can afford to do these things. It's not too expensive. The actual cost we were saying was $60 per ton in the forest that we to apply that. And that transportation is a lot less of a concern when you're doing it for carbon management than when you were trying to just get energy out of it. It doesn't mean that it's a gimme, doesn't mean that you can ignore that, but it's a lot easier to do. And we thought we were going to have to build these conversion facilities right up in the forest, build small things and distribute them all around the place to limit transportation. Turns out we don't. It's not that big a deal. Probably the biggest issue with transportation is, can we stop using diesel trucks that emit criteria pollutants that we don't want? But of course, if you go up into the forest and you talk to the people up there, they're like, yeah, diesel trucks, bring them on, we want them. So there's not a unanimity of opinion about that.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question from L. McGuire related to which agencies are taking the lead on biomass conversion.
So it's all in California Natural Resources under Wade Crowfoot. And I think the chair on that committee is the CAL FIRE, but it has representation from all the agencies, and I hear about it indirectly, and I have to confess I'm not terribly familiar with all the state agencies, but if you would like me to connect you with that group, I can do that. So if you send me an email, I will connect you with the person who used to be my boss, who is now the state geologist for California. And he's been involved, he worked with me helping to evolve a lot of these technologies. So he's on this working group. His name's Steve Bolin, and he can, I'm glad to connect you and you get the real deal on the information.
Great, thank you.
That would be great. And that was me. That's Lynn McGuire. So Roger, do we have your email address? I'd love to.
Here he does. I'm easy.
Okay.
I'm just aines1@LLNL.gov.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Harold, do you have a question?
Just about the slash that you don't want to truck, you could cover it with dirt and do some in situ biochar. Is that a possibility in your mind?
That was one of the pathways that we considered, and it's a pretty good pathway. It's not quite as good as gasifying it and turning it into hydrogen, but it's not bad. And that's what I meant about this being a robust set of solutions. There will be people say, I like biochar, I'm going to do that. Great, it's pretty close. Go ahead and do it. One of the issues around biochar is that the advocates of it like to believe that it's worth a lot of money. They like to believe that it's worth $1,000 a ton. And when we look at the economic scenarios, we don't see that playing out. We don't see that much of a market for it. And biochar, unfortunately, is most valuable in places that have terrible soil. But unfortunately, where the soil is terrible, you don't have wealthy farmers. So they're not buying soil amendments for $1,000 a ton. So it's kind of a problem. We like biochar. It's a good idea. Livermore is actually conducting a big experiment next year. We're going to make 80 tons of biochar and bio oil. And we're very interested in the whole thing. But when we ran the economic analysis, it just didn't make it to the very top of the list.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, those of you that are in the refinery side of it, we're very interested in trying to figure out how we combine these new ambitions for doing bio refining at the Bay Area refineries with some of these products like bio oil. So, if we can make a connection on that, I would like to. This is a thing that really needs to be worked out at a large system level. Is, how do you make all these things? How do you provide enough material to really make these things work?
Great. Any, let's see, Lisa, you got another question?
Yeah, it was actually related to something similar. You know, you'd made a comment about replacing natural gas with biomass as a feedstock for steam methane reforming, and how you can, you know, derive these huge carbon kind of a sequestration benefits from doing that, and recognized under the low carbon fuel standard. But the cost of supplying, you know, a steam methane reformer that's running on cheap natural gas with some sort of gasified biomass, it must be a pretty large differential. And so one question is whether the study that was done address whether the LCFS credit pricing that's somewhere around $200 a ton, is it sufficient to provide enough of an economic driver to do something like that? Or, and then to your point about availability, you know, how long before you might expect that available in sufficient volume that some sort of gasified biomass feedstock would be even available? Do you know much about that?
Timing is obviously the hard part here. How can you expect these things? We know there's a lot of projects in development to do this, so there are a lot of people who are interested. Let me answer your first question though first. That cost curve that I showed you took all those things into consideration. So when we said you could do this for between $60 and $80 per ton of CO2, that's the equivalent of what the LCFS would be. So you'd be paid 200, you'd be spending 80, you'd make $120. The issue there is with a big, something like the size of an SMR, is SMRs are giant facilities.
Giant, yeah.
Very efficient. And that, so, you know, per ton, they do it very well. But, you know, I talk about these things being billion-dollar facilities. That's what I'm looking at. The real issue is, would the LCFS price remain stable at $200 if you started bringing huge new sources of CO2 online like that? And that's entirely within the control of the Air Board. They can adjust the targets in the LCFS as they see fit. So that's within their power to do. And how long is it realistic before such feedstock's available? There's a lot of people who would like to build plants to turn biomass into natural gas. The challenge in California is that natural gas then probably has to go into a pipeline. And there's a lot of people who don't like those pipelines because they leak some methane. And that's the biggest impediment to doing this. If we had a leak-free natural gas system, it would be a lot easier to imagine converting it to renewable natural gas. But there's a lot of people who would like to do it anyway, and there's going to be a big debate about that. And you know, my take on it is, I think the people who sell and supply natural gas should just commit to 0 leaks, and then the rest. And we know that it would take a while to get there, but that's the right target. Just like 0 carbon emissions is the right target.
Great.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Any other questions? So Roger, this has been awesome. You've done a great job in introducing a topic that is kind of new for the Water Task Force, and it clearly shows that you and your team are out there on the front edge of a thought process that we need to get our arms around. And if we're serious about getting to neutral by 2045, you've laid out a great pathway for us. So thank you very much for being our guest speaker today. And for everybody else, look forward to seeing you next month. And hopefully a whole bunch of you have your vaccines by then.
All right. Thank you very much, Gary. Good to see you again. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Roger. This was great.